Welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We would like to thank our streaming sponsor, AARP Utah, for making our virtual forums this fall possible. We would also like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the future of higher education. We are joined by panelist Clark Gilbert. He is the first president of BYU Pathway Worldwide, an online program designed for students who have felt a traditional university education was not a possibility. BYU Pathway serves over 50,000 students in more than 150 countries around the world and has an emphasis on access and degree completion. Dr. Deneece G. Huftalin serves as president of Salt Lake Community College, a diverse institution that educates and trains more than 60,000 students a year in Salt Lake County. Her service on community boards and committees include the Salt Lake Chamber, EDC Utah, Envision Utah, and the Women's Leadership Institute. Daniel A. Reed is the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Utah, the state's flagship university. It provides education to more than 31,000 graduate, undergraduate, and professional students from all 50 states and over 100 countries. The institution generates over $600 million annually for the state of Utah in non-tax revenue and is one of the state's largest employers, with 16,400 plus full-time faculty and staff. And our moderator, Jason Perry. He is the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics and the vice president for government relations for the University of Utah. Jason brings more than 25 years of experience working in the public sector, where he has worked extensively with policymakers at the state, local, and federal levels. If you have questions for our panel, please enter them into our YouTube chat. We will address audience questions once we have completed the moderated panel discussion. With that, I'll turn the time over to our moderator.
All right, thank you, Anne, for the introductions and for all you're doing to help the Hinckley Institute. Particularly grateful for these amazing panelists. I've been looking forward to this because we're talking about the future of higher education. And you three represent institutions that are on the front line of this effort, not just where we've been, but where we're going. And we're gonna spend some time today talking about this because the pandemic has impacted every single aspect of higher education. Our lives in every considerable way have been impacted, and you three have been making some changes. You've been trying to adapt. You've been doing things for your institutions to make sure these students still have a chance to connect to the education process. And there is really no end in sight right now to what you all will remain needing to do for your institutions. So as we get to the end, which will be what comes next, I think it's more important that we start a little bit at the beginning. Before we understand where we're going, let's understand where we've been. So I'd like to go and have each one of you talk for a moment about the impacts of the pandemic on your institutions. When they started to be felt, what immediate things did you need to do to start making accommodations for your students to keep them safe, healthy, and also educated? President Huftalin, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Well, I will share that when the pandemic started, I was on the island of Maui, and the first thing I heard was my acting president texted me to say that Governor Herbert had just mandated that all institutions move to online learning. So I wasn't part of that press conference with some of the other leaders that got the heads up. I had to get home, obviously, immediately. But I think the biggest lift for us was, back then, we knew so little about the length, the severity, the scale. I think for us, and probably I'm going to guess for my colleagues, just the move from 25% of our courses in our inventory being online to almost all of them. Mm-hmm. That just total remote lift, getting folks the technology they needed, getting faculty to understand they could do it. We have a lot of faculty that are really skilled at that, but some that were really frightened and didn't know how to do it. So, deploying resources to help develop them quickly. I think shifting to the online environment and the remote environment was the biggest lift. Certainly all the facility changes came after that in terms of cleanliness and all of that and figuring out what to do. But that was I think the biggest obstacle right off the bat was how do we move all these students online, and how do we do that effectively?
Mm-hmm. President Gilbert.
Well, BYU Pathway is primarily an online institution with a local gathering in 500 or 600 locations across the world. And so our course delivery was designed, just to be seamless because it was already based online. But our local gatherings had to all convert to virtual gatherings via Zoom. And so our student study sessions and our weekly gatherings that used to happen at a chapel or institute building in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints all went to Zoom. And so we had about 25, 30% of our students doing Zoom gatherings before the pandemic. And in 2 weeks, we converted everyone over to virtual. For us, the challenge had been the pandemic criteria was coming out faster in some areas. And so we had students in Asia, students in Washington State who we had to immediately start converting over. And pretty soon we had to go virtual everywhere. And we actually had to go even ahead of the state going to all virtual because we have to operate in so many different policy settings. And it's worked really well, but it did require a lot of adaptation for 500 to 600 separate locations all went from physical to Zoom in a 2-week period.
Huge response needed immediately. Senior Vice President Dan Reed.
So many of the same things that were mentioned before. We have international students from around the world on campus. We also have students studying abroad in places all over the world. And of course, we have a campus in Korea that's an Asia Global campus. So one of our issues is trying to understand how we could get people home, and people who are here who might not be able to go home, how we supported those. And as Deneece said, all the issues about the rapid transition to online. I started having contingency meetings with our leadership team about what we might do. And we went from brainstorming to execution in the space of about a week when people were like, well, we thought this might be a hypothetical and now it's really real. I think that the rapid transition to online was a challenge for our students as well as for faculty. We have vibrant online programs and have for years, but they were a relatively small percentage of our programs, and shifting everything. Different students and faculty were different points of awareness about technology and support for that. I will say one thing that it really exposed pretty quickly, that's something we continue to address, is it exposed digital inequities among our faculty and our students. The ability to have broadband access, but also even laptops and other devices to be able to access the online curriculum. And so addressing that for both faculty and students became and still is an ongoing support issue.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because I think that is something that is represented across all of our institutions. Let's talk about what you all are doing to make those accommodations, because the disparity there became quite visible. Many have talked about them being there. So let's talk, President Gilbert, talk about what you did to accommodate the people that did not have access and had to become very proficient very quickly.
Yeah, it required some, we implemented what we call a bridge scholarship for students who had short-term financial needs to get access. In many places in the world, the only internet access where we operate is a local church meeting house. And so that made it really important for us. In fact, in much of our enrollment in Africa, we have over 8,000 students in Africa, and we have extremely affordable tuition, but tuition's not the barrier, it's actually internet access, where the internet access can cost 2 to 3 times what the tuition costs. And during the pandemic, even though we had internet access available in our church meeting houses, many people couldn't get there. And in some cases, it was so debilitating that they had to take the semester off. In other cases, we used our short-term bridge scholarship kind of get people through the semester until now we have renewed access to our buildings. But for a lot of students, internet access at home really just isn't a possibility. And we've had to have a blend of using our distributed physical meeting houses with bridge scholarships to help people get through that season. Most of our students, even in the United States, 70% of our students are at or below the poverty level.
President Huftalin, how about you?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that became clear, certainly we've always been really concerned about affordability and access to books. I mean, all of those incidental costs to college stack up. So we've always tried to pull different levers, and for, in the laptop or hotspot arena, no different. So the CARES money came out very quickly, which was helpful, the federal help. And we used some of that to buy additional laptops for faculty and staff and hotspots. Part of the CARES money wasn't available to certain students groups. And so we had a lot of student groups that couldn't access those dollars. So we had to create a whole other students in crisis fund to be able to get dollars to help with technology. But the other things that came out are, we also have tons of food insecurity, and we have brew and pantries. And so in addition to digital inequities, we had people that were now struggling where they would normally have come to campus to get some of their basic needs met. We had to figure out a way to continue those services, even with students not coming to classes. The other thing that popped up for us is we tried to keep our library and our computer labs open as long as possible and with staff so that folks could go there and access computers, which we've always had. And as the pandemic started to kind of settle in and the contagious factor started to become more and more aware, I think folks on those front lines, we started to be really worried about what are we asking our employees to do and how do we keep our employees safe so that they don't feel vulnerable while they're also trying to help students.
Yeah.
And I would say for us, many of the same issues. We substantially increased investment in our emergency student fund, both for basic needs, as Deneece said, but also for technology. We allocated a substantial amount of CARES funding to buy over 1,000 laptops and mobile hotspots so we could distribute those to students on extended loan. One of the things this exposed for students, even for places that had broadband, is it was not just a student experience, but when you have other family members now needing to work from home, the demand on broadband in a household could be substantially beyond what might have been the normal situation. And so there are issues there. And of course, when you convolve all of this with the economic malaise that the pandemic created and the economic stresses that families were experiencing, there are a wide set of issues around mental health and wellness of students and how we support those things. We've continued to invest in public Wi-Fi around the campus so students can come to campus and access Wi-Fi in public spaces, as well as keeping labs open where people can access. But what's really interesting is just the confluence of these factors and the interdependence in the way they have affected the lives of people in so many ways. Prosperity, social justice and equity, the technology issues, the accessibility issues, really wicked and complex problems, but expose some important issues our society needs to address.
Go ahead, Clark.
It's interesting because we started this series of responses around digital inequities, but I think President Huftalin mentioned, some people just having basic food needs. And I think the pandemic has not only exposed the digital inequities, but just, most of our students are working full time. Lower income jobs have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And so this whole tier of the market that requires affordability, access, the need for completion, it's almost accentuated that. And the gap in affordable options for students has, I think, really been accentuated by the pandemic. And I think you're going to see as we come out of this, that need will be more acute than ever, not just because people are are struggling financially or have difficult situations in their lives, but I think it's going to cause a lot of people to question how much they can afford to spend on higher education. And, so I think one of the lasting effects of the pandemic won't just be the immediate cost issues, but long term, it's going to have people really look at the value quotient for higher education and either question whether they can afford it or look for higher value options, just because it is such a big expenditure of both time and money for many students.
Well, let's talk about that for just a moment. I've heard all three of you at various times or last year talk about the difference between cost and value, because we're talking about the cost to students. And particularly right now, the question of value, I think, is a very relevant one. You have lawmakers sometimes who are appropriating some funds to a couple of these institutions. And the question of how much does it cost? And there's some kind of idea that it should be a lot less expensive to just push things online, right? All you got to do is just push the button and you're through Zoom, which is completely not the case, I know. So let's talk about that for just a moment, because they even talk to me about that. I know because I've talked to Dan, they've talked to him. Make the case for this. Explain why that's not just a low cost way of doing it. Even Clark, I know you've had to do huge infrastructure pieces, but let's start with you, President Huftalin.
Well, I would say, I hear that all the time because we have 12 sites across Salt Lake County, and the goal of a community college is to be financially affordable, financially accessible, but also geographically accessible. I mean, one of the reasons that community colleges do well is that they're in the neighborhoods and people can physically access them on their way to work or on a bus route or whatever, right? So sometimes I hear from folks, well, how come you have so many different sites, and why do you have to be all those places? Move it online. And for many, many learners, online learning is just fine. I would argue that the further you are in your educational career, the better a learner you are in terms of you've kind of learned how to learn. So when we have a lot of first generation students, and Clark, you probably do too, online isn't always the best way to go. So I'm not going to talk about there are fiscal costs to moving everything online, but there's also completion costs, I would say, from people actually finishing their degree because they're not getting what they need to get through an online delivery. And I think, Clark, maybe you wouldn't agree, but with an online platform, not everybody can do an online platform. You kind of have to make sense of what works for you as a learner. And we were very concerned about students moving to an online environment fully. A lot of our students take it to just fit it a class or here and they're in. Very few of our students go wholly online. And I think that's because being on campus and having the wraparound physical support services that some of our students need help them persist. And they're not going to get that when they're at home with a whole bunch of other people, as Dan just said, trying to use the internet and learn alongside them. That motivation and that sense of wanting to persist and having a community that's counting on you to show up, I think that decreases a bit. And so I think of the cost, not necessarily in dollars and cents, although I could make that case too. I think of it in some cases for certain students as a completion cost.
That's good. Dan?
No, I completely agree with that. One of the things we did this spring was we surveyed our students to try to identify what challenges had surfaced from the rapid transition. And to Denise's point, one of the key things that was essentially unanimous across the survey, and our faculty saw it too, was student motivation. And that's really driven by the circumstances they find themselves in. After all, if motivation were the only issue, you could go to a public library and self-educate, right? I mean, the knowledge is there. The reason we have schools and higher education institutions is to build that other set of experiences. And we know from all kinds of data at all of our institutions and others that what leads to that stickiness, the completion, is you find a family. And there are lots of ways you can find a family. It could be for students who live in student housing and connect to community. It could be a social group. It could be some undergraduate scholarship experience. It could be an athletic activity, but you find a family, and that family is a support group. And that's what pulls you through what the inevitable challenges you find are. But I think into your core question about value versus cost, look, we live in a global knowledge economy, right? And there's an increasing premium on knowledge and the way one applies knowledge in a skills world. That's what higher education is in the business of delivering, is not just educating citizens to be a member of society, but to allow them to compete in a global knowledge economy. And that's both the learning for a lifetime, those critical thinking and communication skills that are part of higher education, but it's also giving people concrete skills that they can go out and apply in the job in the marketplace. Both pieces of that are part of an education, and you won't get that studying alone, and you won't get all of it studying online, as important as I think online is going to be to our future.
You, Clark.
Yeah, there's much of what was said I agree with, but some I really do have a different perspective on. And I remember when I served as president of BYU Idaho, where I had a campus where students took courses on campus and online. I think, Deneece, I had the same thing. I had some students who thought they'd never taken an online course, but they knew it was bad. And so we had a segment who would never take one at all. We had another segment who would take one if it like helped their schedule out. Right. And we had another group who loved them. And that was true in the campus experience. It's interesting because in BYU Pathway, we serve a much riskier population than I served when I was president of BYU Idaho. 70% are at or below the poverty level. 70% are first generation college students. They're working full time. They've dropped out of another college somewhere else. I mean, it's super high risk. But I believe if online is only a digital replica of the classroom, then everything that we've said here is true. Mm-hmm. But for us in BYU Pathway, our online experience is fundamentally a cohort-based experience. It's interactive. They progress in cohorts. We train the students how to be a successful online student. And so students with learning disabilities, students who are first generation, students who are not digital natives, we don't presume they're coming in up here. We build a ramp for them so that they can be successful online. And I think one of the challenges with a couple of the challenges with the pandemic is we're trying to go from zero to full digital, and some students aren't ready for that, as opposed to building them the bridge to online learning that I think we do very effectively in BYU Pathway. The other thing is I worry that people are going to compare last minute what we often refer to as remote learning and say that's online learning, as opposed to a course that had a rigorous instructional design to take advantage of the online medium. And I often will use the metaphor of Les Miserables. I mean, I've seen that play on stage in London, in Broadway and community theater, probably 25, 30 times. I love it. And when I heard they were going to make a movie, I thought they're going to ruin it. That whole experience of like the stage going dark and the light coming down on Jean Valjean. And then I saw them when they made the movie. They didn't just replicate what happened on the stage, but they took advantage of what you could uniquely do through a different medium. And if you've seen the opening scene of the Les Mis movie and the docks and the scale of what they showed, you could never do that on a stage. And for us, online pedagogies, if it's just a video of an instructor or one-way dialogue, I would have similar concerns. But if it's rigorously designed with, when I was a case method teacher at the Harvard Business School, and I was used to looking at people in the eye and reading their body language. Well, the best I could do is get a third of the class into a discussion. When we do an online course and everyone in the online course is participating, throughout that online experience, I have 100% participate. But it's designed for the medium. And, now that does take money and it does take investment. I do think it's more affordable than carrying a fixed physical infrastructure. But to do high quality online learning does take investment. And it's not like you can just drop the price and not invest in rigorous online learning experiences.
I think
I would just like, oh, go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead, Deneece, it's fine.
I was just going to say, I think what Clark is illustrating is they have their mission. They are zeroing in on online delivery in the best possible way, and that's the way they're doing it. So they are probably spending a lot of money on instructional design that is really, really good and effective. So when you've got a campus like mine where you're trying to do a lot of things and you can't invest wholly in one mode, it could suffer, right? And it wouldn't be the same quality. I would argue that he has the luxury of being able to really do it well, and not all, I would agree with you, Clark. We did a lot of remote learning. It wasn't online delivery, right? And that is expensive. And I think that's going back to your point, Jason, with sometimes they think, online is less expensive. We have a good cadre of instructional designers for our minimal online offerings. And I imagine if you equated it, it is pretty pricey.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with what Clark said, that the pointing a camera at the sage on the stage is missing the point. Real online learning, you have to design for the medium, and it's not the same as a live lecture or even a live discussion section. And that, I think, is what's different this fall than what was true in the spring, because all of us had to pivot, literally in some cases in 24 or 48 hours. And a large cadre of really effective teachers and faculty who'd never done this before. We had a vibrant online program, very much like Clark describes, with a lot of investment in pedagogy and training and course construction. What we've spent a lot of this summer is trying to train a much larger cohort of faculty about how to approach this new medium and teach in an effective way that engages students and does all the things he was talking about. Done right, it can be really effective. The social piece, though, let's be honest, we're social animals. We thrive on personal interaction, and all of us in this isolation, this situation, are struggling a little bit with the lack of personal human contact. And we can substitute some of that with technology, but not fully, because you don't get those nonverbal cues and interactions that are so much of what define human interaction. But I think well-designed online instruction absolutely delivers high outcome and high value. Having said that, we've all worked on trying to make things more affordable by reducing some fees and costs and other things, recognizing that these are extraordinary economic times and challenges for our students.
Jason and Dan and Deneece, I wonder if you would echo this as well. On that cost question, if a university is growing, there's so many more levers they can pull. If it's not growing and you add online, you've just added costs. And it's the same footprint, all the same expenses exist. And now you have costs to do online, especially if you want to do it well, as has been talked about. It just had cost. When I was serving as president of BYU Idaho, we were growing every single year, and we used online to offset some of that growth. So instead of having to build a new building for growth, we complemented it with online. But if we weren't growing, online would have just been another expense. And so a big question, on whether online raises or reduces costs. Now with BYU Pathway, I have no infrastructure costs. Like we don't build buildings. I leverage the global footprint of the LDS Church, but I don't have a campus anywhere. But at BYU Idaho, the reason online lowered costs for us is the underlying population was growing. And because of online, I didn't have to keep building as many buildings. And that started to lower the cost. But if your enrollment's capped, or if it's stagnant, and you want to add online, it is going to add expense to the system.
Good. Let's talk about that for just a moment, because I think it's such an interesting aspect. We talked about there's a difference between what we want to get out of these online classes. It's not supposed to be just a replica. It's not just, I was in class, now I turn the camera and now we're online. But I'm curious how this is being received by the students so far, because we see in some parts of the country, even here in Utah, I think a lawsuit against BYU from one of these students saying, well, I'm just not getting what I paid for. So I was paying X for tuition and I expected a certain kind of education. Now I'm getting something else. How are you addressing that? I guess, Clark, you don't have to hit that one so much since you've already been there, but for Dan and Deneece, how are you answering those questions?
Yeah, I think I guess there's an assumption in that lawsuit that the online learning isn't as effective or isn't the same or isn't as high quality or something. And I think that's a false assumption in many cases. So that's one flaw, I think. But the other flaw is you're still getting the credit, and credit builds. And if when you have so many credits, you get a degree. And so when we didn't have a lot of students push back on tuition this spring. We have had more conversation about fees, student fees, which most of us have adjusted a little bit, but tuition, not so much. And when I've said to students who have raised it, if you want a reduction of your tuition for the spring, that means you'll have to take those classes again and earn the credit. Oh no, I don't want to do that. So, they liked that they were on the trajectory. They liked that they were going to earn the credit. And so I think students, in some ways, I think that's kind of a reactionary thing to be thinking about. And when you really stop and think of the logic behind it, it doesn't make sense to demand a refund of your tuition. The one thing we did do, and I think a lot of people did this, is the whole idea of adjusting the grading at the end of the semester and giving students that pass, withdraw, grade option, because for some students, they realize, boy, I might really tank this semester and I don't want my GPA to suffer. And that was a place where we did relax the rules and create more options for students to try to accommodate that. But I don't think the idea of refunding tuition has merit given what students are getting at the end of the semester for it.
I think that's true. And we obviously did similar things. We moved to optional pass, credit, no credit, recognizing, not just the issues around pedagogy, but the fact that students were finding themselves in a whole variety of personally difficult circumstances. Maybe a parent or supporter lost their job, they're in challenging environments. So the flexibility was really important. And I do believe that high quality online is important. It's one of the reasons why I said we've invested so much time and energy in alternative models to train more faculty about how to operate better in this new environment, but also recognizing the fiscal realities. We froze tuition, we reduced our fees by 25%, we waived all the online fees, we, as I said before, beefed up our emergency fund, loaning, technology. We're really focused on trying to address affordability. Launched a new scholarship program, the 4 Utah scholarships, so that Pell eligible high-performing students could attend the U at zero tuition and fees. So, we're all doing a variety of these things to try to address this balance of cost and value. And, most higher education institutions have a mix of fixed and variable costs. There are costs that we have to pay people, whether they're teaching 10 students or 100 students, and those don't go away. And then, there are a variety of other support costs, but we're all sensitive to the value proposition about higher education and trying to address that in ways that are obvious to students and reflect, our commitment to, as certainly I think all three of us would say, we're in the business of transforming lives, and education, for all of the questions that have been asked about it, is a transformative societal force. It's still the only thing I know that lifts people out of poverty in a single generation with very high probabilities of success, changes the trajectory of their lives. And it's important to us hang on to that value. That's the core thing that defines what we do. We're in the business of transforming lives and helping people realize their dreams. And it's important that we do so in a way that what happens to a person is not defined by the zip code of where they're born or the color of their skin, but by, as Dr. King said, the content of their character and their willingness to pursue those dreams.
And Jason, I might just add, I think for us, and I know President Watkins and my other colleagues said the same thing, I think there was some real concern when this pandemic hit that the way the students would react to it would be to withdraw from college, right? Drop out, hunker down, try to keep your job safe. We all saw that the folks that lost their jobs first are most of the folks without credentials or degrees, right? It's folks who do not have a particular skill set. And so they were the first to go out the door and more, easier to fire or furlough. So a degree, finishing your degree gives you some insulation from these economic, times when we drop down. And what we did not want to have happen is, in addition to a pandemic, in addition to economic crisis, retreat from your educational goals. That's just gonna make everything worse, because it's gonna delay your ability to strengthen and get the credential and strengthen your space and your foundation in terms of your economic input. So we were messaging like crazy. This is not the time to not finish your degree. This is the time to, turn up the volume and get through it.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Exactly.
Can we talk about that end product? What I've been impressed by all of you is you're connected to the community, and at some point we're doing this education, which is so valuable. But at the end of it, a lot of these students need to get a job also. So I'm curious what you are doing with your students right now for employers. When your employers are looking at these new ways of instruction, are they happy what the students are going to get? Are they still as confident? And maybe we'll start with Clark on this particular part of the question, since you've been online solely. I'm kind of curious about that, or maybe does it lend a little bit to the kinds of classes, the kind of courses as well? Because that gets from what Clark's doing to Deneece to the scientists in the labs, Dan, because you got to think about all of these things when you're doing it. Do you mind starting with that, Clark?
Yeah, part of we place 70% of our students who complete their first certificate. We have a certificate first approach. That's a job skill. We have students do that before they start into their GE credit. And so it's an effective way to show the relevance of college right out of the gate. And 70% of the students who complete that certificate get a better job. That's actually a really high immediate job placement rate compared to most universities. But it's a little bit reflected of not just the quality of the experience, but we also make sure everything we offer leads to a degree and a job. So we've done work with employers, as many of my colleagues on this call do, to know what's marketable and what is working in the market in the first place, so that when the student completes a certificate, we don't offer anything that we don't know leads to a high likelihood of a job improvement. We also have in that first certificate training on how to do a LinkedIn profile, how to do a cover letter. It's required in all of our first student onboarding, so that they have the skills to find a job beyond any support they might receive from us directly. And so I think the key is really finding things that employers want, building a good reputation with employers, making sure the curriculum is job skill oriented, and then training students about their responsibility to be active in networking, using tools like LinkedIn, how to write a cover letter, and how to interview.
Yeah, I guess, we have a significant portion of our degrees and certificates are kind of career and technical education focused. And so we have a lot of program advisory groups, industry, business leaders that sit with us and look at our curriculum, look at what we're focused on, and make sure that we're adjusting where we need to. In many of those cases, not all, but in many, they do need hands-on learning. Like our diesel technicians, it's really good to get in here and, you know, roll up your sleeves and actually work on an engine, or, you know, take the truck out and really make those move around those cones. Just don't do it on, you know, VR. So we had to figure out a way to, we front loaded a lot of lecture credit. And then when we could open up our labs safely, find, you know, larger spaces, change the equipment out, make sure we had protocol in place. At the end of spring and even into the summer, we brought spring semester students back in some of those lab areas to make sure they had that hands-on experience, right? Those dental hygienists were really in the chair working on each other, or they were really truck driving. I do think VR is actually pretty cool. And there's some, our welding folks have a really cool VR component that they use. But I do think our industry leaders, where in certain occupations, were very comfortable or knowing that we were bringing students back for a certain hands-on level of training where they could, in a practicum kind of way. And we just did that as best as we could. In many of those spaces, they're large anyway. I mean, when you're trying to bring a big semi in, you've got a big old lab space, so we could move people out, and we were able to accommodate that. But I think that's how we've helped our employers see our willingness to, you know, pay attention to their needs and make sure we're delivering on them.
Yeah, I think similar things. One of the things that we sort of have talked about implicitly, but Deneece brought up, is when all of us rapidly pivoted to online in the spring, one of the things that we lost was that experiential component. You know, at the U, we're talking about teacher education, all of the health professions, dentistry, nursing, physicians, pharmacists, social workers, architects. That experiential component, you know, literally getting your hands dirty in some cases, is a critical part of education. That was one of our top priorities this fall, even though the majority of our classes are online, was to preserve that experiential component. And concurrently with that, we've been rapidly expanding our certificate offerings, both for non-degree seekers to help people with upskilling in the economy, but also to support our students, to give them that mix of lifelong education, but also skills to go out and get a job.
Jason, I think you're muted.
A little slow there. We've got to use all this great analysis you've just done, the connection to industry, and you are now 3 futurists, all right? So we need to know where we're going in higher education. All of you have spent so much time thinking about this, but let's get, for a lot of students that are watching this program today, because they are curious about what's coming next for us. What is the future of higher education? So let's go. Let's think big. All right. Tell us what you're doing, but what you see making a difference, and where higher education is in the next, maybe not just the next 6 months to a year, but down the road a little farther. Who wants to go first? Because it's kind of big. Who's feeling it?
Listen.
I'll jump in and say one thing I think is we're probably going to have to let go of the notion that you get an education and then you start life, but that life and education are inextricably intertwined for your entire working lifetime. You'll go back and forth to get reskilled, upskilled, learn new things. Because the one thing that we know is the pace of change is accelerating, and that acceleration means that we have to continue to adapt. So the notion of you leave school in your early 20s and you go work for 30, 35 years and retire, I think is gone forever. And so that notion of building a lifelong social compact between educational institutions and students, that we're there for you, you're there for us, we're always working together, has got to be part of the way we think about futures. So that means multiple on-ramps, multiple off-ramps, just-in-time education, meeting people where they are in different kinds of ways. It's got to be a much more nimble kind of experience, I think, just given the pace of change.
Dan, are we still in the classroom in 5 years, 10 years?
I think in part for all the reasons we were talking about, but it's also true that if you're 45 and you need to upskill, you may or may not be able to come back to the classroom, but you probably, if you do, it won't be 8 to 5, we'll have to meet you where you are given your situation. And as Deneece said earlier, that may mean physically meeting you where you are in terms of point of access, but it'll be more nimble in terms of start when you need to start. After all, our 9-month semester model is something that in both K-12 and higher education, we've dragged from 200 years ago in an agrarian economy where people needed to work on the farm in the summer. That doesn't have to be true anymore. So being able to enter and exit education when you need it and where you need it, I think will be one of those other changes.
One more thing before we move on, Dan, from you. The University of Utah has primarily a research-oriented mission, which is doing exceptionally well. I mean, is that changing as well? These are still going to be working in labs on site, right?
Oh, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, traditional education is not going to go away. I think it's just going to expand a bigger envelope. One of the things that a public research university does is, we're in the business of creating new knowledge. And one of the ways that you transfer that knowledge out into practice is having students working with those scholars, those researchers. They pick up those hands-on ideas, they pick them up and they take them out into the real world. So that's going to continue. It's just, we will add more layers and more nimbleness to the process. So that notion of education, of knowledge creation, community engagement and partnerships, economic development, that I think is always going to be there.
Okay.
Dan, do you think the teacher training programs will change? Like, so the way we teach our teachers how to teach?
I suspect they will for the reasons I mentioned. One of the things that we always have to remember is I think in the near term, we overestimate change. In the long term, we tend to underestimate it. But, and so we do want to preserve the things that have worked for several thousand years, and they're really core values and approaches in higher education that have been generation after generation proven. But yeah, I think a little more nimbleness and adaptation will probably be part of the process.
Let's have Clark go for just a moment, because I want to make sure you have an appointment. I want to make sure you get to take a minute for you, the future and your space that you're occupying and the growth.
I really like what Dan said about new innovations that are changing the industry, that this idea of lifelong learning, the idea that you go to college, learn a skill, and then deploy that skill for the next 50 years. That's such an antiquated notion. People are going to be learning throughout their lives, and continuous adult learning is going to be there. I think the adult and non-traditional markets, that 18 to 24-year-old second or third generation student population is just a shrinking share. And the real growth is happening in the adult learning population and in non-traditional students, and new modalities and are growing up all over the place. There's a great piece in the New Yorker by an NYU professor named Scott Galloway, who predicts the death of higher ed. And, he talks about Google and Apple and Microsoft all getting into the education space. And they're going to do it, but they're not going to come at the experiences that traditionally we assume is the higher education model. They're going to come in these other periphery areas that are growing actually much more rapidly than the traditional model. And, I spent, as a formal academic, I spent 15 years of my life studying industry evolution. The death and birth of industries doesn't happen head on. It comes from the periphery, and, institutions that are effective at reaching non-traditional students with different cost structures and different value propositions, they're going to grow over there. And I think, well-run, quality traditional institutions are going to be robust for a while. The ones that will struggle, in this state, we have a pretty affordable education, whether you're in the state system or in the church educational system. Utah has some of the more affordable education in the country. I'd be much more worried about really high-priced institutions that don't offer a lot more value when they can't adapt and they're asking students to pay 30 grand a year for college, those are going to be vulnerable. And it's not likely that you're going to see the contraction at the U of U's and the Salt Lake Community Colleges, but some of those very expensive, very traditional institutions, that's where I think the risk of transformation is going to really hit. And we see, I mean, BYU Pathway, we're growing at record levels now, but most of that growth isn't coming from traditional pockets of the population. There are people who couldn't get to a campus. There are people who couldn't afford a traditional university experience. And I think that's what the pandemic's going to do. It's going to fuel the growth of the periphery, not come head on to the traditional experience. And well-run traditional providers are going to still be robust and a critical part of what we do as a higher education network. But these new forms of innovative models are going to help amplify and grow these non-traditional segments of the economy.
Great points. Deneece.
Yeah, I think Clark's got right on the money. I think if I was the president of a small liberal arts college right now that was tuition dependent, I would be very, very nervous. I think the academy that has been held on to in terms of some of those traditions and isn't willing to go for different markets or a different mode, or isn't willing to kind of adapt a little bit. They don't have to move their entire mission, but I think adaptation, nimbleness is really, really going to be critical. I still think there's going to be classrooms. I always think there's going to be students that learn best in a classroom and teachers that teach best in a classroom. But I think our faculty are going to get much better, and the technology is going to improve, and we're going to be doing things through technology that we would never have imagined. So that, I think, is growing and expanding. The other thing that I think, and I hope that this comes true, is I think in this last, 8 months in our nation, the role that a university or a college can have in their community to lift the community has become it's become more visual, more immediately seen. And I think we're aching for that. So solving community problems, being in your community as the higher ed institution, rather than sitting somewhere waiting for them to come to you and get your degree. You go to them and say, what do we need to help? How can we help? How can we work alongside you to help? I see the U has done that with COVID, with the research. I mean, they've been leaders in this state in the research piece. And so, everything's amplified about what great docs and researchers we have at the U. That's a community contribution that maybe wasn't as illuminated before, and I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is the history of higher education in this country is one of increasing democratization. I mean, if you think back to the 1800s, I certainly would have never gone to college. You had to be rich, landed gentry. And if you think about the Land Grant Act and the Civil War, the GI Bill, greater investment in research at universities, the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, it's been about broadening and democratizing access, because our people are, after all, the only infinitely renewable resource of a society. And when we invest in those, we reap the benefits. But there's been a history of change, and we're sometimes inclined to think that higher education has been static and immobile. It doesn't look anything like when we were young, and there's no reason to believe that it will look the same when we're gone. It responds to societal needs because that's certainly what we're all in the business of doing, hanging on to those eternal principles about the value of educated citizens, but responding in ways that society needs to make a difference, whatever those differences happen to be.
I'm so curious as we close here, and I believe President Gilbert needs to go also. But I'm curious about one of the comments that came. If the changes come from the periphery, which they certainly seems to be the case, I'm kind of curious if our trajectory changed because of how swiftly we had to do this. Are we ending up in the place where we were heading all along, or has it just been pushed up by a few years?
I think I'll just weigh in and then I need to hop off. I think it's accelerating a trend line that was already there. And look, I remember when the digital camera was coming out, and going on a family trip, and it was like, for years and years, we got out this silver halide chemical film camera and took a picture because this could be the Christmas card, and then we got out later our iPhone, and it's like, yeah, but I got to email this one to grandma, and for years we took out both devices because they did different things, and I think a crisis accelerates that, where you're like, you know what, that digital camera on my phone is pretty good. And it's gotten better and better over the last couple of years. And I'm tired of lugging around two cameras. And I think a crisis accelerates something that's already there. But again, I think it doesn't come head on. You don't immediately substitute one for the other. You use them for different things for a long period of time. And I just think classroom teaching, campus experiences will remain a robust part of what we do.
Yeah.
And the very best at doing that will stay rigorous in that domain for a long time. But I think some of these new models will just continue to create new growth. So I'm gonna hop off a little early.
Yep.
Deneece, Dan, Jason, so good to be with all of you, and thanks for letting me be part of this today.
Thank you, President Gilbert. For Dan and Deneece, just really quickly, that same question. Have we just accelerated the timeline? Are we just getting we're changing the old phone for the new phone?
Yeah, I would agree with Clark. I think what I love about what happened is that people that thought they never wanted to do something have done it and have said, oh my goodness, this is actually kind of fun. I mean, it forced people to do things they didn't think they would ever want to do. And it forced people to see that they could do it very successfully. And so I think that acceleration and maybe that will help us take on new change and challenges faster. Maybe it will change our psyche a little bit to realize, you know what, I'm pretty adaptable. I'm not going to hang on to some of my fears like I used to. I'm going to move faster and be more, learn in a quicker way. That would be a nice thing to have come out of this.
That's good. Dan?
I think Deneece is right. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is never waste a crisis. And we did an unexpected forced experiment. It certainly let some people see that, yes, online education did not have to be the evil and disaster that they might have feared. Yeah, there were some hiccups given the rapidity of the change, no question about that, but lessons learned. I think the other thing it has exposed is let people think about process efficiencies in different ways. I suspect we'll see a lot more virtual meetings in the future because they're quick and efficient, and we'll see a lot more electronic paperwork and other kinds of things, many things that some universities have been slow to adopt that are common in the business world that just make things more efficient. And I think a recognition that delivering content via multiple modalities that students can choose among for the very reasons that Deneece mentioned earlier. Some students learn better in different ways. We know that. There's a lot of pedagogical research that says that. So giving different options for students to be either online or in person, small groups, synchronous, asynchronous, we'll see much more flexibility in that as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the great conversation today, a little view of where we've been and where we're going. I'll tell you, one of the things that both of you alluded to that I've noticed for sure is this pandemic has made the value of education even more important. In fact, it's going to be these educated people that are going to save us all at some point. So it's become more clear that we need all of you, and you all are just cutting edge. And I'm so grateful that you're in the spots you are for what you're doing to help lead us through. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Jason.
Pleasure to be with you all.